The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts Allison Furno and Debi Vandenboom.
Today's topic is all about propositions. I'm here joined today by Greg Blackie. Let me see if I can get this title straight. Deputy Director of Policy.
That's correct.
Oh, yay, I got it. At the Arizona Free Enterprise Club. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so first of all, what is the Arizona Free Enterprise Club so that people know what that is? Because I'm sure they've probably heard of it, but maybe don't know what it is and what you guys do.
Yeah, for those who aren't aware, the Arizona Free Enterprise Club has been around for around 20 years. We're a nonprofit policy organization that primarily engages down at the state legislature. So we advocate for policies around tax reform and limited government, good government, also on election integrity and some other issues. We'll advocate down at the Capitol and also oppose what we see as bad policy. And then we also engage on ballot measures and issues up and down the ballot.
All right. So basically things that make it easier to do business in Arizona. Would that be accurate? A lot of the things that make it either better or worse to do business in Arizona, laws that relate to that is one of the primary things that you guys deal with, right?
Yes, that'd be one of the primary areas, but we also engage on a host of other issues: transportation, energy, elections, all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Well, very good. Thank you. And so tell me a little bit about you before we get started so that we know who you are and what just a little bit, whatever you want to share with us.
Yeah, I'm originally from Tennessee, born and raised just outside of Nashville, Franklin, Tennessee.
I've been there.
Yeah, beautiful place, but I moved here in 2016 to go to Arizona State University. I graduated in 2019, and my last semester was a full-time internship at the legislature for the Arizona House Republican Caucus.
Okay.
And so that kind of got me into state politics in Arizona, and did a little bit of political tracking in the 2020 elections, and then joined the club at the beginning of 2021, and I've been Deputy Director of Policy and doing lobbying and policy work for the club since then.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's interesting because you were talking about being at the legislature, and it's just a whole different thing to be down there. I've spent a lot of time at the legislature before I was doing what I'm doing now. I spent a lot of time going to meetings and hearings and votes, and you spend a lot of time waiting for things to happen. It's like hours and hours for 5 minutes of testimony or some little thing that goes on. It's
a hurry up and wait is the motto. Yeah,
definitely absolutely. Is one of those. So, well, we're so glad that you're here today as an expert on this. And one of the things that I get a lot of questions on, people asking me questions about voting, about the elections, the propositions. They're very confusing. People don't understand what they are, what they do. They're worded sometimes, I feel like, intentionally confusing. We're trying to make that a little bit better, I think, with some of the rules that we have around that. But with that, let's start just a little bit about what is, because we have them in every state, right? Every state has some capacity of having ballot measures. Arizona is a little bit different in that, but let's just talk for a minute about what is a ballot proposition. So what is one?
Yeah, so and most states do have some sort of proposition on the ballot, whether they're local or statewide, but not all quite to the extent that we do here in Arizona. In Arizona, we have a couple different types of propositions. You could have statutory measures, and that means they're amending state law. And so that means on your ballot is the ability for the people, instead of the typical legislative process, to amend state law. But we also have constitutional amendments, so those that would amend our state constitution, and those end up on the ballot. And then we have local measures as well, and those could be tax-related issue or bonds or overrides for school districts or cities. And so those are kind of the various different measures that can end up on your ballot. And there are various different ways that those make their way onto your ballot in Arizona. In Arizona, there are two really ways that a measure can end up on the ballot. The legislature can refer by a simple majority, so a vote to pass a House or Senate concurrent resolution to place a statutory amendment or a constitutional amendment to the ballot. Or the people can collect signatures. And if they collect enough signatures, they can petition the government to place a measure on the ballot. either to amend statute or the Constitution. And those signature requirements, it's kind of a weird setup, but it's 10% of the number of people who voted in the previous election for governor for a statutory measure,
wow.
and 15% of the number of people who voted for governor in the previous election for a constitutional measure.
That's a lot of really complicated math there in that.
The good news is the Secretary of State does it for us. They'll post it each year
Yeah.
and say, you need 383,000 signatures to qualify, and then people can collect signatures.
Yeah, so that's and there's a lot of numbers, and one of the things I know sometimes they get into where, things are challenged and for different reasons, the number of signatures, and you guys challenged one this time around, right? Did that end up getting booted from it's on the ballot, right? It's still on there because it happened after they had already gone to print. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm sure we'll get into talking about that specific measure because it is on the ballot. The remaining question is whether or not the votes for it will be tabulated or not. And so we have engaged in initiative challenges in the past. We've engaged in putting measures on the ballot and also on this side of challenging the signatures because we believe that before something appears on the ballot, they should actually have the requisite number of signatures to qualify.
Novel concept,
yeah,
right? That
absolutely.
You actually have the number of signatures required
Yep.
to get it on there. So to sum up what you said, I think there's two ways that things can get on the ballot, right? Either people put them on, your average citizen, which in Arizona, sometimes those are coming from out of state, which we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But so citizens can start collecting signatures, or the Arizona legislature can, by simple majority, put something on. And I know that right now there are a few more of those than we normally have, and I think is the reasoning because the governor, they can't get anything passed. She's vetoed everything. Am I correct in saying that, that the governor keeps vetoing legislation, and so to kind of put it before the people to vote on some of these things that they wanted to pass or that they did pass but she vetoed, they're going about it in a way of getting it to the people to vote on some of those measures. Is that an accurate way of explaining that?
Yeah, I'd say that's absolutely a good inference to take from. We've been in the first 2 years of divided government in Arizona in quite some time with Republican majorities in the legislature and a Democratic governor. And so obviously that can create some friction and an inability to get bills signed into law. And so lawmakers can look to this as an avenue and a tool to kind of get around the governor and go straight and appeal directly to the people. And we would say that those are many of the wins that the majorities that the legislature were able to accomplish in the last couple of years, is to put some of these critical measures on the ballot before voters so we can make some good changes in the state.
Yeah. So, because I think that we have not seen as many of those in years past as we have this year on the ballot. There's more of them, I feel like, than there were in years past. It's mostly been citizen-initiated ones, in my experience in Arizona. And then there are, like you said, there are three different types, right? So there's a constitutional amendment, and the ones that are on statutory, they split between legislature and if you don't know, they're numbered according to those, right? So 100 is
100 would be all of your constitutional amendments, but it will not tell you if it was citizen initiated, i.e. the people collecting signatures, or if it was the legislature that referred it. But all 100 are constitutional amendments, either referred by the legislature or collecting signatures from the people.
And what's the difference then between if it's a constitutional amendment, it's a little bit more, I don't know what the word would be, but it's a little bit more serious of a thing. I mean, they're both difficult to change or undo because of a law that we have in Arizona, which we'll talk about in a minute. But a constitutional amendment means that it's not just a law, it actually goes into our Constitution. And we do have a couple of those, right, on the ballot, or is I know there's at least one.
Several constitutional amendments this year.
This year?
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of constitutional amendments. And I think logically you say the Constitution, it's more severe or more substantial because the Constitution trumps state statute. But as you mentioned, there's a mechanism in state law in Arizona that kind of complicates that a little bit.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So 100 is constitutional, 200 means that it's a statutory, but it's citizen initiated, and then 300 is statutory, but
legislatively referred.
Okay. So if you see a number on there, that's what those numbers mean. They don't just randomly pick them, they put them in. And so we had talked a minute ago about there is a specific thing in Arizona law which has been kind of a a tricky, it was like it had good intentions, I think, when they passed it initially. There was a reason why they did that, because they kept passing ballot initiatives, and then the state legislature would go in and basically gut them and make them, like, the people would vote on something. I think they were all border related, like the people would vote on something border related, and then the legislature would go in and just eliminate everything that was in there. So they passed, what's it called?
It was Prop 105 in 1998, I believe.
It's been a while, yeah.
Yeah, and what this does is it kind of creates citizen initiatives, turns them into these kind of super statutes where, unlike a normal law that the legislature can just amend by a simple majority vote and getting the governor's signature, anything that's passed on the ballot, those 200s or 300s that amend statute, are voter protected under Prop 105. And so the legislature cannot touch those statutes. If they want to amend them, they have to obtain a 3/4 majority, which is nearly impossible to achieve. Plus, whatever they do has to further the purpose of the initial initiative that was presented. So basically, what's passed on the ballot is locked into place, and you have to go back to the ballot again to make any further changes.
Right, and I think your average voter just does not understand how serious it is when they're voting on one of those propositions, that's going to be basically set in stone. And we've seen some bad ones come through that have had issues, with legalized pot and the minimum wage that created all kinds of problems. And they cannot be fixed. I mean, you can't go in and fix anything because you just can make it stronger, or, it has to be within that, what you just explained. So I always am telling people, when those signatures come around, don't sign them. Just don't sign. Unless you really are 150% sure that you know what this thing is going to do, don't sign it. Because when the signature collectors come around, they often lie. They either lie or they don't know what they're talking about. You see a lot of where they're paid collectors. I've had exchanges with people in parks and parking lots and asking them questions, and they don't know what it is that they're getting people to sign for, and so they can't really fully explain it. And then two, they always want to tell you, just get it on the ballot so people can vote on it. And I'm like, no, do not get it on the ballot. That's terrible. We don't want it on the ballot. So I'm always sounding that alarm around the time when everything is collecting signatures to get on the ballot. And then also the other rule of thumb that I typically tell people is, if you're looking at a ballot initiative and you're not sure, vote no. Like, it's better to err on the side of not passing something that could have been good than it is to get something bad in there that is almost impossible to get rid of. So it's like, when in doubt, vote no on those. Okay, so I thought I had my list here, but I do not have my list. I'm hoping you know these off the top of your head. The numbers of the ballot initiatives that we have currently, because there are 14 of them, I think, is what I counted.
Might be.
Including the one that is not really supposed to be on there.
Yeah, I guess we can count right now. We've got 133, 134, 135, 136, 137, 138, 139, 140. So that's 8 constitutional amendments, potentially. And then we have 311, 312, 313, 314, and 315, so another 5 statutory. So those would be the total 13 that are on the ballot. 1 tentatively will be counted.
Right, and that's 140, right?
Correct.
And that's the one you guys fought. Let's start with that one, just because that's an interesting kind of story of how that... Because 140 is terrible, right? Let's just say that right off the bat. It's a terrible initiative. What would it do?
Yeah, so Prop 140, there's been a long effort, not just in Arizona, but in other states, to do things like ranked choice voting and jungle primaries. And this threat was coming to Arizona for years. And so over the last couple of years, we've been sounding the alarm, and other activists and organizations have, that there's a group that actively wants to impose California-style election schemes in the state of Arizona, and that's what their measure does. So Prop 140, it's a sprawling 5-page amendment to the state constitution that has 15 separate amendments. This is being presented as a simple open primaries measure, but in reality, it does much more than that. And so it ushers in, like I said, California-style elections. We call it that because California has tried these open primaries, which are really jungle primaries, where every candidate is listed on one ballot and everybody votes on that same ballot. And what you end up with is only candidates from one political party appearing on the general election ballot. So they're telling voters that this is about increasing choice and access to the ballot. In reality, it's reducing choice almost entirely. Because if you're a Republican in a district where only 2 Democrat candidates win the jungle primary, you have no option in the general election. Vice versa, if you're a Democrat and you're presented with 2 Republican candidates, and then you have independents and third parties. So that's one of the problems. But even worse is this measure isn't a clean jungle primaries to ranked choice voting. They put a measure in this Prop 140 that gives total power to the Secretary of State, one partisan politician, to decide how many candidates proceed from the jungle primary to the general election.
Oh, wow.
So that power is in the hand of one person. Now they'll say that the legislature gets to decide. It's only if they fail to do so that the Secretary of State gets to. But right now we have divided government. And so the odds of our legislative body agreeing with our governor about what to do is very slim. And so that puts it in the hands of one person to decide unilaterally with no check. And this is supported by a group called Save Democracy. So I find it a little odd that the group Save Democracy wants to consolidate power into the hands of one person. And then from there, you end up with a patchwork ballot because the secretary, again, unilaterally can decide for the gubernatorial election that he wants 5 candidates to progress. And if he does that, ranked choice voting has to be used, meaning you rank your candidates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, instead of just selecting or voting for one candidate. But if for the Attorney General, it's more advantageous to have a one-on-one race. He can just say 2 candidates proceed. And that happens up and down the ballot. So you'll go
they can fiddle with it and make it work in their favor.
Absolutely. You'll go up and down your ballot. Ranked choice voting on its own is confusing, but now just wait till you have a ballot that is mixed with ranked choice voting for one election and then traditional voting for another, all the way up and down the ballot. We know it creates longer lines. We have a ballot with like 89 different things on it here in Maricopa County, which is going to take long for people to fill out anyway. This will just increase the time and burden to fill out those ballots and then to tabulate as well.
Yeah. So, and I think I want to back up a little bit and kind of explain some of what you said, because I think your average person just doesn't even, understand some of what you and I are talking about here, in that just even the difference between a primary and a general election. So typically, when we have primary elections, which we voted on in August here in Arizona, you're voting just within your own party. So you have, if you're a Republican, you have an entire ballot full of just Republican candidates, and you're voting and you're picking who's going to go ahead. We did an episode on that, Allison and I did, on how that worked. So you're picking who's going to go, to the semifinals, right, or the final round, if you use this sports kind of into the Super Bowl of the election. So you can tell I'm really sportsy, right? I'm using all those words. So anyway, that you pick just one senator, one representative, whatever the case is, to go on to the November election. And then in the November election, you have one Democrat, one Republican, possibly a third party in the mix in there too, that are going against each other for one seat, whatever it is. And so what you're saying is that in that primary, you could leave and have no Republicans at all, only Democrats running for a seat, and have to choose between 5 people or 4 people instead of just 2, right, on a ballot. If you're having, it makes it really more complicated. It's already complicated. People get confused by their ballot as it is, and that would make it 10 times more complicated. So it would just be a mess. It's a terrible idea, this Prop 140. So if it will probably be on the ballot, and it shouldn't be. We'll talk about why in a minute, but if it is, we're saying vote no on that, because that would be a disaster to have even crazier election confusion. But then also tell the story of what happened with that and why it should not even be on the ballot.
Yeah, and I'll just say, not only us encouraging a vote no on Prop 140, but now bipartisan opposition to the measure as well is coming out now that it's getting closer to the election. And so you'll see third parties like the Libertarian Party who says, this will prevent their ability to nominate candidates for general elections. And a lot of the proponents of this measure say that it's about providing access to independents. But in Arizona, independents can vote in our primary elections.
Right.
They just only get to vote in one. They can't vote in every single primary. They get to vote in one, the Republican or the Democrat Party. This would actually make it more difficult for them to put candidates on a general election ballot.
That are not one of the 2 major parties, yeah. Yeah.
And so, they've been collecting signatures since the end of last year, and they turned signatures in early July, as other measures did as well. And we took a look at those signatures. Some individuals did, and they challenged the eligibility of some of those signatures and alleged that it doesn't have enough legal qualified signatures to qualify for the ballot. And it's been long litigation through that case. And eventually, the trial court ruled that he wasn't going to include the evidence of duplicate signatures. So these are people who sign the measure more than once, which obviously violates the principle of one person, one vote. People shouldn't be able to sign more than once. But he decided to not include the evidence of those duplicates. It went up to the Arizona Supreme Court. They sent it back down to the judge and said, no, you need to include the evidence of these duplicates. You need to go and look at the evidence and determine whether they're duplicates. And if they are, then you need to proceed accordingly. And since then, the judge has been doing that. There was a special master appointed. This is kind of another judge who's given leave to go and look at all of the signatures. He came back with his report just recently and found that 99% of those 40,000 duplicate signatures are in fact duplicates. And it's no surprise. I mean, you had people in there who had signed more than 15 times. You had hundreds of people who had signed more than 5 times.
Wow.
Those signatures should not be counted. And so that's what the special master found. And so from the statutory mechanism for calculating how many signatures a measure has, that puts them under the minimum requirement to qualify for the ballot. However, that trial judge decided we're past the ballot printing deadline, it's already on the ballot, and so the whole thing's moot anyway. And so where we stand now is it's back up at the Arizona Supreme Court where they can decide whether or not they will enjoin tabulation, so prevent counting the votes, because it never qualified to begin with.
Okay.
So that's where we are. Historically, these are resolved before the ballot printing deadline,
Right.
so they don't even get printed. This one, because of the complications of litigation and frankly the other side trying to run out the clock, it went way past the ballot printing deadline. But the simple fact is they don't have enough legal qualified signatures. They don't qualify, and we hope to see the Arizona Supreme Court institute justice and say that, no, we're not going to count votes for a measure that doesn't qualify.
So we're using California-style
Math.
math to get it on the ballot even.
Absolutely, yeah.
It kind of, the jokes make themselves on that one. But so that's crazy. So hopefully that, so we say no on
Still vote no.
Vote no on 140 just in case, to make sure that if it does, something crazy happens with it, that it does not go into effect, because that would be really bad. What other ones have you guys had a stake in? Like what other ones are you guys, the Arizona Free Enterprise Club, talking about?
So we've had a stake in almost all of them. I'll just briefly touch on one that relates to 140, and that's Prop 133 that will be on your ballot, and we'd encourage a yes vote on that. It kind of exists or emboldens our existing direct primary, partisan primary system in Arizona. It goes back into the state constitution and basically ensures that every political party has a right to place candidates on the general election ballot. So that would mean schemes like jungle primaries that can't ensure that result in one-party rule on the general election ballot can't take place in Arizona. So
that would
conflicts with
protect it
140.
from happening later, right? So if they don't get 140 passed, then that would mean that they can't come back later and try to get it again.
They'd have to amend that new section of
Right.
that Constitution. And also, since you have two conflicting measures in Arizona, some people wonder, well, what happens if both of them pass? If both of them pass, since they conflict, the one with more votes carries. And so if 140 passes and 133 passes, but 133 gets one more vote than 140, then 133 prevails, protecting our existing primary system against the California-style schemes from 140.
Yeah. All right, so that one, and then what's next on the?
I'll just go in numerical
go
order.
for
So
it.
134, which is maybe one of the most important for this election cycle, and that's what's called geographic distribution. So we'd encourage a yes vote on 134. What that does, and we talked about this briefly earlier, is that every election cycle, there are out-of-state special interests that pour millions of dollars into our state to try and put their bad ideas on our ballot. And they often do so, like you said earlier, by shipping in out-of-state circulators and paying those circulators to park themselves in Phoenix and Tucson, at the ASU campus, at the U of A campus, and collect all their signatures in just those two places. And under current law, they can do that. 134 geographic distribution would require them to get signatures from all 30 legislative districts in the state of Arizona, giving rural Arizonans a voice, allowing them to participate in the process. Like you said, when people try and tell you, well, just sign it to get it on the ballot, most of Arizonans in rural parts of the state are completely left out of that process.
Yeah.
They don't get to decide what goes on the ballot. So 134 gives all Arizonans a voice. It'll increase participation for rural Arizonans and really ensure that what ends up on our ballot is actually representative of what people from the entire state want, and not just college students at ASU and U of A.
Well, and what you said is really, I've seen it in action, right? You have from Oregon, from Washington, from California, and these groups come in, very extreme left-leaning groups that come in, and they because Maricopa County is big, and then Tucson is and they get all of those signatures in just one little concentrated area. And that's definitely not representative of all of Arizona. So that was what number again?
Prop 134.
134, and we're saying yes.
Yes,
on
and
that
also
one.
on that one, we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that not every state has an initiative process like Arizona does, one that's so open to the people. But of the states that do, a majority of them have a geographic distribution requirement.
Okay.
So this has been tried and tested in other states, and this would bring us kind of in line with what most states are doing.
Well, it makes sense to me that would be, you would want to have kind of a broad, it's very similar to what, this, I don't want to get too into the weeds on this, but it's very similar with talking about doing a popular vote instead of where it cuts out the whole middle of the country and you're just dealing with the coasts, right? So just California and New York then can elect a president. And it doesn't matter what any of the Midwest or anybody in any other states has to say, which is why they want to do that. And you're just focusing on these urban areas that have a lot, really high population and tend to be more left-leaning than where in a lot of the rural areas or the areas that are, the middle of the country or in rural areas within a state are more right-leaning, typically, not always, but so it makes a more even distribution of people having a say in what goes on. Is that flyover country that they talked about in a couple elections ago of, ignoring the flyover country. And so that's a very similar, it seems like this would more evenly distribute that say, the voice in having that. Okay, so 134, yes. And what's next?
Very next, 135, also a yes. This is the measure, we all lived through it in 2020, 2021, through the COVID lockdowns,
Yes.
right? Where schools were shut down. Some people were told they couldn't go to churches. They couldn't go visit their loved ones in hospitals. Kids were kicked out of the classroom. All of these things that persisted well beyond the 15 days to slow the spread. They went on for, in Arizona, 743 days, practically unchecked. So what Prop 135 does is it says that any use of emergency powers, if they're authorized by law, will automatically terminate 30 days after the emergency is declared, unless the legislature extends it by a majority vote. But it also importantly empowers the legislature to call themselves into a special session with just 1/3 of the members. And when they're in the special session, they can terminate an emergency on day one. That's important because right now it takes 2/3 of the members of both houses to call a special session. So if our current governor were to declare an emergency, for example, over climate change, and
Right.
say that people can't drive because it's a threat to public health and to the environment. Right now, our legislature's out of session. They're powerless until they come back in on the second Monday of January for another
yeah.
session. With Prop 135, they could, an hour after Katie Hobbs declares that emergency, they could call themselves into special session and terminate it immediately. So this is a really vital and important measure to kind of restore the balance of powers and checks and balances, separation of powers. So we'd very strongly encourage a yes vote on Prop 135.
Okay, sounds good. And then what's next?
So Prop 136 would be next, which kind of relates to Prop 134 in that it addresses the initiative process. We call this kind of pre-election initiative challenges. Those same out-of-state special interest groups that spend big money to come into Arizona
So
and put
much
their bad
money.
ideas on the ballot. Well, oftentimes those ideas, and it's probably because they're out of state, might not even be nefarious. They don't know how our laws or Constitution works, so they put these poorly drafted measures in front of voters that are sometimes unconstitutional. In fact, sometimes they know they're unconstitutional and they put them to the voters anyway. A great example is in 2020, Prop 208 was on the ballot. For those who don't remember, this would have been the largest tax hike in state history, doubling the income tax in the state of Arizona. The only problem is that their measure was unconstitutional, and the nonpartisan attorneys at Legislative Council told them, this is unconstitutional, you can't do this. They did it anyway. And so multi-million-dollar campaign was run on both sides. It passed by a slim majority, only for a year later the Supreme Court to strike it down and say, this is unconstitutional, you can't do this. The problem is right now, you can't challenge the constitutionality of measures before they appear on the ballot. You have to wait until after.
And
So
then you're spending all this money to try to stop it and challenge it and just So much money, yeah.
Absolutely. Prop 136 would allow any person to challenge the constitutionality before it goes on the ballot. So this protects our ballot from unconstitutional measures. Hopefully it will encourage those out-of-state lawyers who are drafting these measures to actually write constitutional and workable measures. But it's really important to protect our ballot.
Or to stay out of
Out of our state. Yeah, entirely. Yeah.
Stay in your own state. Leave us alone. But yeah, so that because it's crazy, and we do, it's like they like to keep things in the courts. A lot of times these some of these really far left leaning groups, they like to win by lawsuit and get things challenged and get them in there, either to get rid of things or to what they can't get passed in the actual legislature, right, or by voters. They want to win in the courts. Okay, so what number's next? You're doing a fantastic job. I had my list and I forgot to bring it over here, but yeah.
So I'm going to skip over the next two constitutional measures. We can come back to it if we want to, if we have
definitely
time.
Want to.
Yeah, but I'll just skip now, and also the first 300 levels. And by the way, if anybody wants descriptions of all these measures, you can go to azballot.org, and there's a description and our position from the club for all of these measures. But just kind of the most important, the next I'd go to, outside of a measure you'll probably discuss shortly, is Prop 312. So this is a statutory measure referred by the legislature. And this goes after the problem of homeless encampments throughout the state. This is a really important measure. Cities and towns kind of refuse and fail to do their jobs to protect businesses and private property owners from the ills of homeless encampments and public nuisances. What Prop 312 does is it says if a city fails to enforce their own ordinances against public nuisances, and a business or a property owner incurs expenses for protecting their own property at their own expense, they can get a reimbursement up to their property tax liability in that jurisdiction to help cover those costs. And I'll just say, historically, the only way you can get cities and towns to do their job and to follow the law is to come at them where it hurts, which is the purse.
Right.
And so they start losing some of that money.
They'll take it seriously.
Yeah, they'll take it seriously and hopefully start, actually using the police force to, protect business owners so they don't have to hire their own security guards or board up their windows. And we'll start kind of cleaning
because we've seen this in a lot of other cities where it's just been terrible, and businesses have to close down because they can't, and it's just, like the poop in the streets in San Francisco and different places, right, where that they talk about on the news. But that if you're a business owner and you can't, what do you do, right? If you have to either spend your own money to get it cleaned up, or you can't even run a business. And it's getting worse, just in general, I think, and in Phoenix specifically, it's a whole different story than when I was growing up. I mean, I was born in Phoenix, and it's been like nothing I've ever seen, the number of just homeless. And again, if they're causing trouble, keeping businesses from, we're not talking about just people, trying to survive, right? But ones that are creating problems for businesses, you see that a lot. So I think that's a great idea, personally.
We pay taxes to have the city and town and counties
taking care of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if a business owner or private property owner has to incur their own expenses because the city's failing to provide the services they're supposed to, they should be able to be reimbursed for those costs.
Well, and that number again was?
Prop 312.
312. Okay, so what else have you got?
And then the next one that I'll cover is Prop 314, and this is the Secure the Border Act. So you had mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, probably or potentially one of the reasons we have so many measures is because Katie Hobbs, the current governor, has vetoed a lot of the good ideas from the legislature, and this is one of those good ideas that she had vetoed. And it kind of mirrors what Texas has been doing to help secure their border, which is empowering local law enforcement to apprehend individuals who illegally cross into our state outside of a lawful port of entry. And then those individuals kind of have two choices at that point. They can either go to jail or they can self-deport themselves. So we'll walk them to the border and make sure they go back to the country that they came from. And so that's Prop 314, the Secure the Border Act. And we'd encourage a yes vote on that one.
Okay. And so you said that was one that passed the state legislature, but she vetoed it.
Absolutely.
Okay. Is that the end of your list, or do you have more?
Yeah, so I would just briefly touch on, if we have the time.
Yeah. We have a couple minutes.
Okay, then I'll just breeze through some of the descriptions. 137 is a judicial retention measure. Right now in Arizona, you probably flip to the backside of your ballot and you see a list of 50 names you've never heard of. Those are judges. In Arizona, we have retention elections for judges. Prop 137 would change the process to say, instead of appearing on the ballot every 6 years, they would only appear on the ballot for retention if they fail a performance review, or if they're convicted of a crime or they go into bankruptcy, some sort of bad behavior that would put them on the ballot for retention. And so that would prevent 50 plus judges appearing on the ballot. We also have a problem in Arizona with kind of left-wing organizations who are targeting good justices for their lawful and good decisions, and kind of making politics out of
Right,
the
because
judicial
they'll
system.
uphold a law and judge rightly, and then they get a group of people that try to take them out so that they can get actual partisan political judges in there that will, again, use lawsuits to be able to create policy. So that's been a big problem, because they'll get just enough people to target a specific judge who's done nothing but uphold the law and get rid of them, because they don't want people who follow the Constitution. They want people who will legislate and pass and uphold things that are unconstitutional, but that are what they want, the laws that they want in place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the last one I would cover is Prop 138, the very next one, and this is the tipped wage earner protection. There was actually as I think you mentioned, you said that some of the examples of bad measures passed in Arizona was marijuana, and then also the income tax, or the minimum wage increase. So for those who don't know, several years ago, again, out-of-state organizations pushed a minimum wage hike in Arizona, and then unfortunately that passed. Well, they were back again, a group in this last cycle, trying to collect signatures to increase the minimum wage even more. But worse, they were going to try and close that gap for tipped wage earners. Right now, restaurants and service industry can pay tipped wage earners $3 less than the minimum wage, as long as they make at least minimum wage after tips.
After tips.
Yeah, so the legislature put a measure on the ballot to compete with the measure that was collecting signatures, to put in the Constitution that employers can pay tipped wage employees 25% less than the minimum wage, as long as they make at least $2 more than the minimum wage after tips. And this is kind of important protection, because we're a target, like you said, for out-of-state groups, and we're especially a target for these minimum wage hikes. And they're really coming after the service industry and tipped wage earners. And so Prop 138 would protect tipped wage earners and restaurants and kind of keep restaurants affordable, because it would increase that threshold if they wanted to come back and try this again. They failed to qualify this time around, but they were very close. It would make it much more harder for them to decimate the restaurant industry in the future. So that'd be Prop 138.
Okay. And then we've talked a lot about 139. I know you guys don't take a stand on that, but 139 is the abortion amendment that would increase abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy and allow minors to get an abortion without a parent knowing about it, and do a lot of it. It would eliminate all of our pro-life laws. We have laws in place that are designed to keep women safer, to make sure that they get an ultrasound ahead of time to prevent abortion pills from being mailed in the mail, things like that. And all of those pro-life laws, those protection measures, safety standards would go away, and you would have legalized abortion through all 9 months. It would open the door to us having to pay state funding for abortions and allow a minor, at any age, 12, 13 years old, to be able to go in and get an abortion. And one of the things we've talked about is that really that then protects abusers and traffickers, because if you have a soccer coach that's abusing a middle schooler, he can then take her in to get an abortion. And the reason they find out a lot of times that there is abuse going on is because she gets pregnant and they know about it. This would just make an easy way for them to cover up sex crimes, and just as a really bad idea all the way around. There's so many things that are wrong with this. It's very extreme. Abortion is already legal in Arizona through 15 weeks, which is into the second trimester. So this would increase that threshold and make it even later. And a lot of people don't understand that it is legal through 15 weeks already. So that is a big no on 139 from Dream City Church. We're saying that no on 139, and make sure you're telling people that definitely to vote no on that one. There's also a sex offender. Do you remember the number on that one?
Yeah, that one is 313.
That is increasing the penalties, right, for sex offenders. From what I've seen, that one looks like it's a good one. From that, it just is increasing the penalties on that. I've seen some mixed things on that, but from what I've seen, I think that's probably one that would be safe to vote yes on.
Yeah, that one is if somebody's convicted of child sex trafficking, that they have a mandatory natural life sentence, meaning they're not eligible for parole.
Then yes, so they're not eligible for parole if they're sex trafficking minors. I think that sounds like a good idea. What is the number on that one?
That's 313.
313. And then isn't there one too? There's one about police. What's the one on the police?
Yeah, so Prop 311, this measure creates a state version of an existing federal benefit, death benefit, for the families of first responders who die in the line of duty. And so it would establish, I think it's a $250,000 death benefit. So if a first responder dies in the line of duty, the family of that first responder would get that payout, and they fund it with a new $20 fine on all criminal convictions.
Okay, so if you're convicted of a crime, you have a $20 fine that's added into that, and that money goes to help pay for families that, so that is Prop
311.
311. And then did we cover all of them? Is that all?
Then the last one would be Prop 315, which is kind of some oversight of the executive agencies. So, Hobbs is in charge of all the agencies and the unelected bureaucrats who get to write rules and regulations. 315 would say if one of those regulations would cost the industry or business that they're regulating an estimated $500,000, then it wouldn't take effect until the legislature ratifies it. And so this would kind of prevent unelected bureaucrats from writing regulations that are going to kill business. It would require legislative approval for that.
Okay, and do you guys have a stand on that one?
Yeah, we would say support and vote yes on 315.
Yes on 315. All right. So you may have to go back and listen to all those again to get all those numbers, because that is a lot of them. And then sometimes there's other ones too, and cities have their own props and things that we didn't even list, but that's at least 14 probably, because 13 plus the one that shouldn't be on the ballot but is, so that would be 14 propositions on the ballot. That's a lot to go through, so, re-listen to this, get a pencil out and write down those numbers and keep track of them. And so thank you so much for coming in and explaining it. It's such a confusing thing for so many people, and I really appreciate your insight and your expertise on this matter. So thank you so much for joining us on Into the Fire, sponsored by Dream City Church.
Thank you.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify and follow us on social media. Find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.